Hey everyone, today I am bringing you a tutorial as part of the January Marathon Society event. We are sewing up the Alice from Lacus Designs. Alice comes in two sizes. It has the crossbody / wristlet size and also a wallet size. Today I'm going to be sewing up the bigger of the two. The large size measures 8 inches wide, 5.5 inches tall, and 1 inch deep. And the smaller size is 4.5 inches wide, 4 inches tall, and 1 inch deep. So it is a good size for throwing in a few different things, your phone, a small wallet for a date night for errands, great size for kiddos. It has 2 pockets at the front that are designed to be card slot pockets. It has magnetic snap closure. It also has a zippered compartment on the inside and then a hidden slip pocket at the back. You can use this as a pouch without any type of connector. You can use it as a crossbody or you can do it as a wristlet. I am making the crossbody version. I am going to be doing a webbing strap, but you can do a strap from your coordinating fabric also, or you can do a wristlet strap. And there are all of those instructions included in the pattern, and I will put some links for how to make a wristlet strap and a crossbody strap in the video. But we're going to be sewing this pouch today. It's a great pattern for practicing sewing and top stitching curves, for learning how to install magnetic snaps if you haven't done that before. I'm going to demonstrate a riveted D-ring option on the one that I am making, and it comes together really quickly. If you've made a lot of zipper pouches, this will be a piece of cake for you as an upgrade to your skills. If you've made a lot of bags before, then this will come together so fast. You'll be really impressed with how quickly you can throw one of these together, and you'll get a really fun, useful bag out of the process. So let's get going. For this tutorial, you will need all of your pattern pieces cut and interfaced per the instructions. I've also added the marks for the magnetic snap. I have added fusible fleece to my exterior main pieces to add some structure to the bag. And I have also trimmed 1/4 inch of the sides and the bottom of my lining piece so that it tapers in, so that when I am sewing around my lining, I can use the same seam allowance for the entire bag pattern and have a nice snug lining on the inside. The first thing that we're going to do is place our magnetic snaps. You will need your flap lining piece and your front exterior pocket piece. You'll also need 2 sets of magnetic snaps for the big size, 1 set for the small size, and 4 pieces of some kind of stabilizer to back your magnetic snaps with. You'll need a pen, and I like to use a seam ripper to cut my holes, but you can use whatever your preferred cutting tool is. We already have our marks placed. Double check that your pieces are oriented the right way. When you lift your flap up, this is the direction that will be up. We're placing our magnetic snaps at the top there. On my front pocket piece, it will be folded over like this. So I want my holes here. So at the bottom of that piece. I like to take my washer. I've got the center hole marked from the markings on the pattern piece. And I'm just going to draw the little lines for making the slits. I'm going to cut those with my seam ripper, and then I'm going to copy the slits onto my Decaville Light backing pieces. When I am using my seam ripper to make the slits, I put the point of the seam ripper at the bottom of that mark. But then rather than just slide it straight up, I'll poke the point out the top of the line so that I can slice that line without worrying about cutting into the rest of my material. Take your magnetic snaps and we're going to place them. You want to have your socket portion, which is the section that is going in on the main part of the bag. So you're going to poke the prongs through those holes. If you've got a material that frays, you can put a couple of drops of fray check around the prongs also. And you're going to put the stud portion on your flap. I'm going to grab my fray check and just put some little drips of fray check around those. Not too much so that it doesn't wick through to the front. take your Decaville scrap, you're just going to place that over the prongs on all 4 of those. Then take your washer, place that over the back, buried underneath here. And then we're going to fold our prongs. I like to fold my prongs out. I feel like I get a flatter install when I fold them out, but it's personal preference which way you want to do it. Both will be nice and secure. And then I'm going to cover those washers with some duct tape. If you have trouble getting your prongs to turn out, you can use a pair of pliers. And the duct tape is for added security for that magnetic snap so that it doesn't pull through the material, and also to protect the material that will be rubbing up against that on the other side. I like to just press around that to keep it nice and stuck down. Then you can set the flat piece aside and we'll continue working with our pocket piece. You're going to fold the top edge down to meet the bottom edge, and we're going to clip along the long open side. Then sew along this edge at 1/4 of an inch, backstitching at the beginning and the end, but leaving the short ends open. Turn that front pocket out through one of the short edges. And then using a seam roller or your iron, we're going to press that nice and flat. We're also going to press along the top here so it will be ready to be top stitched. When you're happy with that, we're going to take it over to the machine and we're going to top stitch along this upper edge. I like to start my top stitching in the side seam here where I can back stitch to secure the threads. Sew along the top, turn again, and back stitch down on the other side. Using a longer stitch length and sewing at 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Once you have that top stitching done, we're going to mark the center of this card slot piece. I'm going to fold mine in half to find the center, make a crease, and then I'm going to draw a line down the middle using an air erase pen. If you don't have an erasable pen, you can use painter's tape to make that line so that you don't have any marks on your fabric. You can also use a ruler to measure that. You want the bottom of your pocket to be 1/2 inch up from the boxed corner cutouts. Use clips to keep that in place. I like to double check that it is nice and straight. Then we're going to head over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew down one side, across the bottom, up the card slot and back down again, across the bottom on the other side, and then up the last outside edge. When you are sewing the middle, you can choose to do your up and down stitches in one row. You can choose to do that separately first if you want to backstitch at the top and at the end, and then sew the bottom and outside edges, or you can sew down one side, across, sew on the outside of one side, come across a stitch or two, and the outside of the other side, back across the bottom and up the side. It's up to you how you want to do it. I am going to use a shorter stitch length at the side and backstitch well at that top edge. So straight down, this seam will be hidden inside the side seam allowance. Come all the way past, backstitch again for added security, pivot, and then I'm going to sew across the bottom using a longer stitch length to match the stitches at the top, 1/8 of an inch from the edge. It is a little bulky here because that is where the seam is, so you may need to increase your tension to get even stitches. Come up to where we drew the line, pivot. I'm just going to reposition my needle so that it's hitting right where I want it to. And I am going to sew up this line and then back down in the same line. Come all the way to the top, add an extra stitch. I'm going to do 2 back stitches just to make sure that it is secure. Turn it around and I'm going to sew straight down the same line. come back to the bottom, pivot, and continue along, sewing again at 1/8 of an inch from that lower edge. And as I come to the other side, I'm going to shorten my stitch length again, take a stitch or two, come back off the bottom edge for added security, come up the side, come beyond the pocket, back stitch, and finish up. Set that piece aside and take your 2 flat pieces. Double check that you have your snaps installed, and then you're going to place your flap right sides together, the lining and the exterior, and clip around the outside. We're going to sew around the outside edge of this flap, but we are not going to sew the top open edge. We're going to be sewing along the edge of our interfacing piece, around the curve, along the bottom, and up around the other side. If there is a mismatch between the weights of your material, for example, I have vinyl for my exterior and I have cotton woven for my lining, I am going to sew with the lighter material down, and that will help reduce any shifting between my layers. So I'm going to sew vinyl side up around this edge using a shorter stitch length. When I get down to the corner, I'm going to slow down and I'm going to do 2 to 3 stitches at a time and pivot so I get a nice gradual curve around the edge of that interfacing piece. The same on the other corner, and continue up the other side. And then I will back stitch at both the beginning and the end. Using a shorter stitch length, and again, following along the edge of this interfacing piece to get the intended seam allowance. Back stitching at the beginning. Careful of the magnetic snap as you go past it. Come up to the corner, take it nice and slowly. I like to raise the presser foot slightly as I come to the curve, pivot, lower it again. So 2 stitches, raise it slightly, pivot, until I get all the way around that curve. Back stitch again at the top, leaving that upper edge open. We're now going to trim the seam allowance. You can use regular scissors or pinking shears. When you come to the corner, you're going to trim around the stitch line. So you're going to be trimming off a fair bit of that corner. And using pinking shears or scissors to put little snips in will help that corner to smooth out nice and flat when we turn a flap out. You don't want to get too close. You don't want to accidentally snip your stitches, but you want to be close enough that you're going to reduce that bulk when we turn it. Turn your flap the right way out. And if you have a point turner, you can use the curved edge to smooth that rounded edge. Gently roll the seams. Then using an iron, a seam roller, or finger pressing, smooth that out so that we can top stitch around this entire flat piece. Sew around the entire flat piece, including the open edge, using a longer stitch length, sewing at 1/8 of an inch, and I am going to back stitch at the open edge since that will be hidden inside the seam allowance. I tend to roll my seam allowance as I go to keep it nice and even, to make sure that I don't have a lot of my lining showing from the outside, and also to make sure that I've got a nice straight line and that the vinyl isn't causing the edge of my flap to bow in. When I come up to the corner, I'll do it the same way as we did the construction of the flap, sewing 2 stitches, raising the presser foot to pivot, 2 more stitches, Same again, to get a nice gradual stitch line on that curve. Take your completed flap and your other exterior piece, the one that does not have the pocket on it, and we're going to attach the flap. You're going to center your flap up on that exterior piece, and we are going to make a mark that is 1 inch down from the top edge of that exterior, making sure that the flap piece is lined up at the bottom. We're now going to sew the flap to the exterior piece. I'm going to clip it along the bottom, making sure that it's centered. You can mark your centers. I put a tiny snip, line up the 2 center marks, and at the edge. Double check that your distances are the same on both sides of that flap. And then I'll also place a clip in this corner to help keep that in place. It's a little tricky to see my marks on this vinyl, so I'm going to grab some painter's tape to mark that point. And that mark is just 1 inch down from the upper edge. And that point is so that I know where I am going to stop my top stitching. We're going to sew around here using a top stitching stitch length. I'm going to back stitch at the top. Because we are creating the slip pocket here on that exterior back of the bag, there may be some stress here. So you're going to want to back stitch well. You can even pivot and do a couple of horizontal stitches there, or place a rivet there after you have sewn that to help secure the upper edge of that slip pocket so that when the flap is opened, it doesn't undo those stitches. I'm going to sew with the longer stitch length at the sides, but at the bottom, I'm going to use a shorter stitch length to secure that flap to the exterior of the bag. I'm going to start about 3/8 of an inch in from that edge, and I'm going to back stitch here to create some added security for that slip pocket. Then I'm going to pivot, and I'm sewing down the same stitch line as we made when we did our top stitching. I'm going to shorten my stitch length to sew along the bottom at 1/8 of an inch. Lengthen it again to come up the other side, sewing in that stitch line, coming up to the mark, and I'm going to pivot again and just sew a couple of stitches in from the outside to add that extra reinforcement to the slip pocket. I'm going to pull those threads through to the inside and tie those off. And as I said, you can also add a rivet to reinforce that upper edge of that slip pocket. Set that piece aside and grab your zipper tape, making sure that your pull is on and that your zipper is cut to the specified length. Fold your zipper tabs in half and make a crease. Open it back out and then fold the raw ends into the center. Take your 2 completed tabs and you're going to place one on either end of your zipper tape. If you're using a directional print, just consider which way that print is going to go. I just flipped mine around because my zipper will go this way in my bag. So I want my directional print to be facing that way up. We're then going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew these tabs on at 1/8 of an inch. I like to start sewing at the edge here like we did with top stitching our card slot piece, back stitching, pivot, sew down the side and back stitch again, doing the same on both ends. Take your completed zipper and you're going to trim the ends of those tabs. And then we're going to mark the center of our zipper tape and the center of all 4 of our pieces, being the 2 lining pieces and the 2 exterior pieces. I like to slide my zipper to one end so that I can more easily tell where the center is. Crease it and mark the center. Your zipper tape has these stay stitch lines in it, so if you're just making a small snip at the side there, you won't get any fraying. Before we go any further, I want to show you how I have adjusted my lining piece. Because in this pattern, the lining piece is cut from the same piece as the exterior panel, you do need to account for that when you are putting your lining inside of your exterior. In the pattern instructions, they have you taper your seam allowance. So you start off using 1/4 of an inch and then gradually increase as you get towards the bottom of the bag. But rather than do that, what I have done is just trim 1/4 of an inch off the entire pattern piece at the sides and the bottom, and I have tapered the upper edge so that the uppermost portion of my lining is still the same width as the exterior of my bag, so that when I am sewing my zipper on, I don't have a smaller piece here. So that is another option. Rather than tapering your seam allowance, you can cut your lining piece ever so slightly smaller so that it fits better inside of your bag. So working with one lining piece, your zipper, and one of your exterior panels, we are going to sew the first side of the zipper. This is the frontmost part of the bag. By convention, most zippers open from left to right when the bag is facing you. I'm using double-sided tape. You can also use clips. Put the double-sided tape along the entire upper edge. Remove the backing. Take your zipper tape and you're going to place it teeth side down on your exterior with the pull to the left side, lining up the center mark, pressing it from the center out. You want to make sure that you have enough of a gap at the end there to allow you to sew that side seam. Otherwise, you're going to have a wavy zipper. Press that in place. Slide your zipper pull as you need to make sure that it is nice and flat at the edge. And if you're finding that your zipper seems wavy, you can also press that before you install it to make sure that it is nice and flat. Take your lining piece. You're going to put double-sided tape on the top of that one also. Then line up the center mark with the center of that zipper on the other side. This is pressing the right side of the lining to the wrong side of your zipper tape, and press that down all the way to the end. And you can see here where my lining piece has just been trimmed to be ever so slightly smaller than my exterior, so it will nest nicely inside when we finish the bag. Press that down. Then we're going to go and sew this side of the zipper to the front, exterior, and lining of the bag, sewing through all 3 layers, backstitching at the beginning and at the end. I like to use a seam allowance of 5/16 of an inch for installing my zipper. That is going to depend on the width of your zipper. If you have a narrower zipper, you're going to use 1/4 of an inch. If you're using size 5 zipper tape like I am, you can use 5/16 of an inch up to 3/8 of an inch, and you will still have good spacing around your zipper. The important thing is that you are consistent in the seam allowance that you are using more than the exact number. I am sewing lining side down using a zipper foot. I've added some clips for added security there, but that's not necessary if your tape is holding well enough for the materials that you're using. Backstitch and continue along. When you get to the zipper tab, take it nice and slowly. Make sure you don't skip any stitches. If you've got a lot of bulk there, you can use a hump jumper. My zipper pull right now is all the way at this end. And when I get to about halfway, I'm going to slide it to the other end so that I can continue in a straight line and not have any bulges as I go past the pull. So So now I'm going to slide my pull to the other end. Backstitch again. Once you've sewn that seam, fold open the exterior. We're going to press that down. Make sure that you have a nice straight line here and that you've got an even gap. No waves in your zipper. And you want to make sure that you have enough space on either end of your zipper for that side seam. I'm going to use my seam roller to press down that fold, make a nice crease there, and then we are going to top stitch this side of the zipper. I'm going to be using a longer stitch length and my Teflon presser foot. As I have been doing, I'm going to backstitch in the side seam, sew across the top, and back down the other side. We are not going to be including the lining. We are just sewing through the exterior and this seam allowance from when we installed that zipper. And that will help us to get nice, neat corners when we sew up the sides of our bag. If you like, you can put some double-sided tape here in that seam allowance. This is on the exterior material, making sure that you've left 1/8 of an inch so that you're not sewing into that when you do your top stitching, and press that exterior down onto that double-sided tape, and that will also help you to get a nice crease there in your exterior fabric. And the same way as when we installed the zipper, we'll slide the pull out of the way so that we're not sewing past it. We'll sew down here, slide it back, and continue along. Take care when you come off this tab. If you have a lot of bulk there, that's a common place that you might get a skip stitch, so you may just want to put your hump jumper underneath to catch that presser foot. Then pivot and backstitch at the other end. We're now going to repeat the process for the other side. Working first with the exterior that has the flap panel, I'm going to fold the flap down, and I'm just going to put some clips in there to hold it out of the way. Because of the added bulk of this flap, this side can be a little trickier to sew on. So what we're going to do is we are going to baste it to this side of the zipper first before we sew the lining piece on, rather than do it all in one go like we did with the first side. We are going to do a double-sided tape just the same all the way along the upper edge of the exterior and of the lining. But rather than sandwich this on either side of the zipper and then sewing along, we're going to baste that first. Remove the double-sided tape backing, lining up the center mark on your zipper with the center on your exterior back, and press that down, making sure that it's nice and flat all the way along. Slide your zipper pull as necessary, and then we're just going to baste along this edge just on the zipper tape at 1/8 of an inch to make sure that that side of the zipper is nice and flat and the bulk of the flap is not pulling it away from the edge of the exterior panel. It's just a basting stitch, so there is no need to backstitch. And I'm going to use a longer stitch length and just sew straight down this edge, making sure that my vinyl and the edge of the zipper tape stay lined up. With the first side basted in place, take your other lining panel, and we're going to line up those centers and press that down onto the back side of that zipper tape. You can use clips or you can use your double-sided tape. For some reason, my double-sided tape today is just not sticking very well. Lining up those centers, pressing it down from the center out, making sure that the sides are lining up. A couple of extra clips if you need them. Then I'm going to sew with the lining side down again down this edge using the same seam allowance as I used for the first side of the zipper to get a nice even spacing on either side of my zipper teeth, and sliding the pull out of the way as we need to so that we get a nice straight stitch line. Slide that pull out of the way, and because of all of the bulk, as we're sewing on this second side, you may find that it is helpful to sew while lifting this main part of the bag up a little. It may help your edges to stay nicely lined up. The bulk of the bag kind of makes it want to pull away from the edge here. Press that seam to the side of the exterior. Check that you are happy with the spacing on either side of those zipper teeth and that your zipper is nice and straight without any waves in it. And once you're happy, we will top stitch this side of the zipper the same way as we did the first side. Again, if you wish, you can put double-sided tape in that seam allowance to help it lie nice and flat. And then we're going to sew along this other side of the zipper. Before we go any further, we're going to talk about our D-ring connectors. If you are doing a wristlet or a crossbody bag, then you're going to need your D-ring connectors. I have my D-ring connector pieces interfaced with an extra strip of interfacing down the center. For 3/4 of an inch hardware, I use a piece that is double that width. So my piece is 1.5 inches and it is 4 inches long. And I'm going to draw a line straight down the middle. And then I'm going to place some double-sided tape down the center. And then I'm going to fold the long edges in to meet that line. Use your seam roller or an iron just to make those creases. And then I'm going to sew around the entire strap connector using my Topstitching stitch length, sewing out 1/8 of an inch all the way around. I'm going to start in the end that will be hidden, backstitch, sew all the way around, and backstitch again for both of those connectors. If you're going to put your D-ring connectors on the side, what you would then do is take your D-ring, slide it onto the tab, fold it in half, and then you're going to place it up against the edge of your exterior. And I like to baste my connector in place before I sew the side seam. You want to make sure that you have enough space to still be able to sew your side seam, but that it is not so far out that it's going to pull and make stress at the side there where it can come out from the side seam of your bag. If you're going to do a wristlet, you would only need one of these. You can decide which side you want to put it on. Generally, I like to put them on the side where the zipper head is when the bag is closed, so that when you hold it by the wristlet strap and then you open that zipper, you can still access everything that is inside. I am not going to do my D-rings as inseam D-rings. I'm actually going to rivet those in place. So I'm not going to place them yet. However, if you are doing inseam ones, you would go ahead and baste those in place before we sew the side seams. I'm going to set this aside for the moment, and I'm going to place the rivets to put those on after we have sewn the side seams. Keeping the flap up out of the way, you're going to place your bag so that your exteriors are together and your lining is together. I find this is easiest if my zipper pull is in the middle of the zipper so that I don't have extra bulk at either end. And you'll also need it like that for when you turn your bag out. Line up your side seams. I like to start with where the fold of my exterior fabric is, line it up on both sides, and then I place a clip on either side of that join, and then I will place a staple to secure those layers together. Line up also the bottom edge at the corner. Don't worry about the flap here for the moment. Leave the bottom open. Then we're going to go back up to this side and we're going to place our staple. Take a look and make sure that those folds are lined up, and we're going to place our staple on this side of that join so that the staple is going through the exterior, not the lining part, in that seam allowance. You're going to place that staple through all of those layers. We're going to be sewing this at 1/4 of an inch, so you're going to want to place it at about 1/8 of an inch. I'm holding my zipper together here to keep those layers lined up, and I've got those clips in place. I'm just going to place that staple right there through all of those layers. And if the first staple doesn't set quite right, you can press another one. Check that the layers are still lined up, that the fold in your exterior meets up nicely at that top corner. And then grab some pliers to just press those prongs down so that they don't catch or scratch your machine. Once those staples are in, you can keep clipping around the sides. And then once I've got the sides clipped, I'm going to take the clips that were holding the flap out of the way off, tuck the flap inside, making sure that it is clear of where I will be sewing, and place my clips along the bottom edge as well. And then on the lining, we're going to be clipping from the outside in, leaving about a 4-inch gap that we will turn our bag through, but also that I'll use to place my D-rings using the rivet installation method. I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew around the outside, sewing from the bottom to this corner, back stitching at the beginning and at the end, starting again, back stitching all the way up, coming across here, going over this join between the exterior and the lining, and I will reinforce that seam there, being careful of my staple, sewing down this end, back stitching again, back stitching at the start of the bottom exterior seam, sew along, back stitch, start again, back stitching, sewing along, reinforcing, being careful of the staple on this side, coming around and sewing down this side, back stitching, and starting once again here, back stitching. And when I come to the opening, rather than back stitching and finishing off at the innermost point, I'm going to start and stop my back stitching about 3/8 of an inch from that opening. So my back stitching will be here and my thread tails will be on the outside. And that will mean that my stitches on the inside of that turning hole will be tighter and there won't be any threads visible there when we turn the bag out. The other thing is, if you have not tapered your lining, when you are sewing your lining, you want to use a greater seam allowance. The seam allowance for the exterior part is 1/4 of an inch. When you are sewing the lining, you're going to add an extra 1/8 of an inch to that seam allowance. So you're going to be sewing this part at 3/8 of an inch and this part at 1/4 of an inch. But because I have already accounted for the lining piece needing to be smaller to nest inside my exterior, I'm going to sew my whole outside edge of my bag at 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to be using my zipper foot to sew my side seam so that I can keep a consistent seam allowance using the width of this part of the foot. And also because when we get up to the ends of our zippers, it does get a little tricky to get past here. I'll also have my hump jumper handy to help me get over the boat there. Back stitching. And then coming back past where those thread tails are, back stitching again. And then we'll start again at the side. It's up to you if you want to cut your threads there or if you want to cut them when you are done. going to pivot where I've tapered that lining. And then coming up to this bulky part, I'm going to take my hump jumper, I'm just going to pop it underneath my presser foot. Make sure that I'm sewing outside of that staple, or inside of that staple, I guess. And make sure that the prongs of the staple are not catching on my feed dogs. You can hand crank it if you need to get over that bulk. Keeping those edges lined up. Where you have the lower edge of your card pockets at the front there, the vinyl at the bottom corner can pull up a little just because of the bulk there. So you just want to be careful as you come down that it doesn't hop off there, and just keep the edge lined up as well as you can. And now we have the bulk of the flap at the bottom. Take your time, use your hump jumper if you need to. Just backstitch a little where the bulk is. The other side of the pocket, take your time, smooth it out. If you have done your strap connectors in your side seam, I recommend sewing over those a couple of times just to reinforce that. You can sew it normally when you do your side seam and then do a couple more stitches in the seam allowance just to really hold that in place. Coming up to the join at the other side. Hump jumper if you need it as you come off the bulk. Just going to hand crank that to help it get over. And if it misses a stitch, you can back stitch. Be careful of your staple if you've placed one. I'm pivoting again where I have tapered that lining. And then coming back up to the other side of where we will leave the opening in our lining, and then I'm going to back stitch so that my thread tails are further away from that opening hole. Before I head back over to my table, I'm just going to check that there's no areas where I've got skipped stitches, particularly where there is bulk. Make sure that I am happy with the consistency of my seam allowance, and make sure that it is nice and straight. And then I will head back over to the table. Before I box these bottom corners, I want to mark where my D-ring connectors are going to go. If you have already sewn your D-ring connectors into your side seam, then you don't have to worry about this part. I am going to be doing the riveted D-ring connectors, so I'm going to fold my connector in half and then fold the short ends into the middle so that they are tucked away. And then I'm going to take that folded connector tab that is now about 1 inch wide. I'm just going to tuck it over the edge of my bag. Now, I still have my seam allowance here, but it is tucked up against that, which will allow space for my D-ring when I place it. So holding that in place, flush up against my seam allowance here, I'm going to take a clip, and I'm going to do the same on the other side. Just tucking that over up against the edge so I know that it is even. Hold it in place. I can feel where the edge of my flap is here. So the edge here is just butting up to the edge of that flap, so it's not going to be in the way. And now I want to mark where my holes are going to go. So I'm going to grab my ruler, and I would like to have my hole 1/2 inch in from the seam and 3/8 of an inch down from this edge of my lining there. I'm going to take this off. That's not where I'm going to be putting the hole in my connector piece. It's just so I can mark it. Take my ruler and I'm just going to measure and make a mark. And then I'm going to make a mark on my connector piece that is 3/8 from the edge and 3/8 from the side, which should be right about the middle. I'm not going to punch that one yet. And then the same mark as this one on the other side, 1/2 inch in from the side seam and 3/8 of an inch down from this edge. And then I'm going to punch the hole through my exterior, both sides at once, making sure that I'm not going to be punching into my flap, which I can feel here, and my lining is out of the way. I'm just going to punch straight through, making sure that it's nice and straight. Put a hole right through on both sides. And then when I turn it out, before we close up this lining, we'll set those rivets. But first, we need to box our corners. So take your staples out if you used staples. And I like to put my hand in here and then flatten my corner. You want it to be flattened so that it has a flat edge here. These sides are not angled, so they don't need to be adjusted to get a flat edge. And you want to fold the bottom of your bag to one side and the side to the other. You can also butterfly your seams open, but you will get a nicer closure in your lining if you fold them to one side so that the base seam of your bag can fold the one way. And just place some clips. I like to clip the edge and also clip at the angled side and make sure that within the bag, the seam here at the bottom is lining up with the seam at the side so that I know that I've got it angled correctly so that the base is going to be nice and flat. You can do that for all 4 corners. For the exterior base of the bag, you may find that it is easier to fold it so that the base goes away from the side that your flap is sewn to. You'll be able to tell just by feeling the way that your bag wants to go. You want to make sure that your flap is out of the way of where you're going to be boxing that corner. You can feel where the flap is, and you can see the line here where we have sewn it to the exterior back. The edge is about 1/8 of an inch outside of that, so you should have room for your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance beyond that flap edge. Taking a look at this, I can see that my exterior is folding the same way as my lining is. So I'm just going to flip this seam to go the other way. So that will also help that lining to tuck down nicely. Once that's all done, I'm going to sew the bottom corners, boxing all 4 of those at 1/4 of an inch. Working again with the zipper foot so that I can easily get past the bulk of the flap, I'm going to sew at 1/4 of an inch, and I'm starting in the middle. I'm going to sew up, back stitch, and sew back to the middle. If you're concerned about visible stitches at your boxed corner, you can use a thread color that coordinates with the exterior material of your bag, and that will help those stitches to be less obvious if your seam opens out a little. Trim all of those threads, and if you find that at this bottom seam where the bulk is of the flap, you are having some trouble with it poking out, that will then cause you to have a curved base on your bag, you can just put some double-sided tape. I've stuck some on this side of the seam allowance to stick that down. I'm going to put another strip to hold the two layers together. Permanent double-sided tape would be a great option for this. I'm just using regular double-sided tape, but it will just help it to stay together when we finish the bag. You can just pop your hand inside to press that down, and that'll help you to have a nice flat base. We now need to berth our bag through the opening in the lining. Make sure all of your clips are off. Double check to make sure you don't have any staples left in your bag. Before we turn it, I'm just going to make a crease to help us close it up. I'm going to fold the lining at 1/4 of an inch from the edge from where our stitches end, and folding it the same direction as we have folded it at the boxed corners. And that will just create a memory crease that will help us close it up after we've turned it out. And now we can turn the bag out through this opening. Once you've got the bulk of the bag turned out, we're going to pop out these top corners here. I like to open out my side seam at the join, and then I'll just place my thumb on that crease in the middle and then push from the inside to get that corner to poke out as well as I can. You just want to work it, focusing on getting it to poke out at the top, and then the rest will follow. Just give it a nice roll. And the same on the other side. If you have a point turner, you can use that to coax it out at the very top. If you're having trouble getting it to roll out, you can also use a hairdryer to soften your vinyl. If you've used cotton woven for your exterior, I don't think you're likely to have too much trouble getting that corner out. But the vinyl can be a little trickier. Some people also like to trim some of the seam allowance back to see if that helps to get that to poke out nicely. And you can see we have our holes here for placing the D-ring. I'm just going to double check that I am happy with those. The connector over the top. That gives enough room for my D-ring. So I'm going to punch that hole, going through both sides. I'm going to grab a couple more scraps of Decaville like we used for the magnetic snaps. I'm also going to grab 4 rivets. I'm going to put my hand inside the pouch and take the stem, the post part of the rivet, put it through the scrap of Decaville, and then I'm going to pop it through that hole. Take one of my connectors, make sure that if it is directional, that it is facing the correct way, and then place that over the top. Place the cap. So that's clicked on, but it is not yet set. D-ring on, flip it over, take another rivet post, put the Decaville stabilizer on, poke it out through the hole, fold the connector over again, over the post, put the cap on this side so that I have a rivet on either side. And then what I'm going to do is take it over to my rivet press, tuck the lining up, and I'm going to press it, the inside of the bag, the outside, with the clamp going around like this through that hole so I can compress it inside, the Decaville supporting the rivet on the inside of the bag. Press this side and this side to secure that in place. The rivets will be hidden on the inside of the bag. So I'm going to go and set those. So this one is set, and I'll repeat on the other side. This one should be a little easier because I don't have the pull in the way. Then I will set those two also. And I will caveat that if you are wanting to use rivets, I would only do it if you have a rivet press. I don't think that you're going to get a secure enough install with a hand press for a crossbody style of carry. Those are both secured. Now I'm going to close up my lining. I'm just going to fold that in, the creases that we made. One side is going the wrong way, but you can still see where the line is. Take some clips. And then we're going to sew that closed at about a 1/16 of an inch. And we're going to start 1/2 inch beyond where our stitches are to make sure that we have entirely closed up that opening. I like to take a look and see where those stitches are. I'm just going to make a mark with my air erase pen so that I know where I'm going to start and stop. And then I'm going to sew along here, back stitching well at the beginning and at the end. Once you've sewn up that bottom, you can trim or mount your threads. Tuck that lining in. I like to press this fold just past the zipper to help the lining to stay nicely tucked down inside of my bag. For making a webbing strap, the first thing that you're going to do is singe the ends so that you don't get any fraying. Thread your strap through your strap slider. Slide the end over the center bar. I like to fold the end of my webbing under, but you can put a strap end on that if you like. You can also do a double fold to further enclose the raw edge. Tuck that up towards where the bar is, holding it in place so that it is lined up with the edge of the long part of your strap. I then like to take some clips to secure that in place. And we're going to sew along this edge. I'm going to be sewing mine with a zipper foot, and I'm using a seam allowance of 1/4 of an inch so that my foot can stay flat on the folded over webbing the whole time. And that will help me get the best quality stitch. Starting in the middle, keep the clip out of the way now, making sure that it's nicely lined up. I'm going to increase my tension +2 over my usual tension setting. Lower your needle and hold your tails at the back when you get started so that I don't get nesting. We're going to sew all the way to one edge, then we will back stitch to the other edge in the same line. Coming back to the middle, pull it off my machine, trim and then cinch those threads. Go to the other end, and you're going to slide on your first swivel, and you want it so that the ring part is facing the side of the strap where your fold is. So you want the flat part here, and then making sure that your strap is staying nice and flat, you're going to thread it back around that fold and out the top. Flip it over, take your other swivel. If you haven't already cinched this end, go ahead and do that. Slide it on again with the ring side facing the back of your strap. You're going to do the same double fold, and you want there to be enough room for you to take 1/4 of an inch seam allowance next to your swivel. And then we're going to clip that at the end. We're going to go over to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew this at 1/4 of an inch the same way as we did the other end of the webbing strap. Melting your threads again, and there you have it. Grab your strap, attach it to your D-rings, and then you are done. That is your completed Alice from Lacus Designs. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.